China's 1994 tax sharing reform strengthened the central government's power by increasing its share of the revenue. But the reform created a financial burden on local governments, which share 50% of the revenue and shoulder 80% of the national expenditures. By using its revenue surplus to help the localities that have budget shortfalls, the central government exercises great fiscal power over the locals, which are also charged with GDP growth. This mismatch of fiscal and administrative powers between central and local governments set the perfect stage for the future storm of a debt crisis. Hello everyone, I'm Lei. Welcome to my show. The 1994 tax sharing reform was celebrated as a major milestone in China's economic reforms. It was engineered by Premier Zhu Rongji and took place during Jiang Zemin's time before Deng Xiaoping died. In my view, the reform is most responsible for the current local government debt crisis in China because it sowed the discord between the local and central governments that inevitably led to an economic disaster. The reform resulted in the central government having a tax revenue surplus every year, while the local governments ran a deficit. This chart shows the trend of net income from 1992 to 2012. The central government, which is the green line, accumulated more wealth, while the local governments, represented by the red line, lost money. Charged with the GDP growth targets, local governments desperately needed to come up with ways to raise funds. In my last video, I mentioned that in exchange for the central government's higher revenue share, Zhu Rongji allowed the local governments to control local state banks and let them keep non-tax revenue. The biggest non-tax revenue has been land sales. So Zhu's two concessions laid the foundation for China's land sale-based growth model and the real estate bubble. Local governments discovered that selling state-owned land was the fastest way to obtain capital without doing much. To keep the funds coming in, they made sure that the demand for land didn't wane. As long as there are large construction projects and the hype of the real estate market, they can forever sell land to fuel the economy. The banks, which are controlled by them, provided the needed financing to developers and home buyers in order to sustain the model. I should mention that what the local government sells is not actual land, but the right to use land. Prior to 1978, private land ownership still existed in China. To prepare for Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, the Chinese Communist Party modified its constitution in 1978 and declared that all land belongs to the state. When people buy real estate in China, they don't own the land. They only buy the right to use it for 40 years for commercial properties or 70 years for residential. So what happens after 70 years? If you want to keep living in your house, you have to pay the government a land premium again. The CCP has engineered a way to keep collecting money from Chinese people without doing anything. Another important feature of the 1994 budget law was that it prohibited local governments from issuing bonds. This created the infamous local government financing platforms, or LGFPs. Local governments circumvent various restrictions to engage in large-scale financing by converting loan-incapable institutions into companies. Then, banks grant credit to these enterprises. The debt raised through LGFPs is kept off the balance sheets of local authorities, but carries an implicit government guarantee of repayment, so it is called implicit or hidden debt. The common type of LGFPs works like this. Local governments grant land use rights to the financing platforms, which use the land use certificates or other state-owned assets to finance infrastructure projects and then repay the initial loan through the land concession revenue. In this model, land revenue is an important source of guarantee and repayment for the debt. That's another reason why local governments keep pushing the real estate market and preventing the real estate bubble from bursting. They need the money to pay for the infrastructure projects. In this way, Chinese homeowners, not the government, have financed China's massive infrastructure. One of the famous cities that adopted LGFP for growth is Chongqing. Its 8 state-owned investment companies were established in 2002 to raise funds for municipal infrastructure. There are the Chongqing Transportation Investment, the Chongqing Highway Investment, and also the urban, the real estate, the energy, the water conservancy, the water utility, and the travel investments. These 8 investment companies were the earliest group of LGFPs, and the Chongqing financing model was copied quickly by other cities across China for urban development. The 1994 budget reform kick-started the local government financing platforms, but it was the 2008 financial crisis that put local government borrowing into overdrive. In response to the global financial crisis, in November 2008, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao introduced the 4 trillion stimulus program, but the central government would provide only 1.2 trillion yuan in funds. The rest, or 2.8 trillion yuan, was to be funded by local governments. And because they couldn't directly borrow funds, local authorities resorted to LGFPs. As a result, local government debts took off as if there was no tomorrow. The number of financing platforms increased from 3,000 in the first half of 2008 to 6,600 by the end of 2010, and the amount of outstanding loans on the platforms was 1.7 trillion in total in 2008. By the end of 2010, the amount in loans taken out by local government alone was 4.1 trillion. The projects on the financing platforms are mainly infrastructure initiatives with high capital requirements and low or no profitability. Also, the LGFP projects focused on government objectives rather than market needs. They are inefficient and sometimes wasteful. While the loans on the platforms are mostly 3 to 5 year short-term loans, and the infrastructure projects take 7 to 10 years to generate return, if there is any return at all, local governments must keep borrowing at higher interest rates or take out new debts to pay old debts. And the debts snowballed bigger and bigger. It forced Beijing rethink its policy that banned local government bonds. So, in 2011, the regime initiated a pilot program to allow local government self-issuance of debt in 4 wealthy provinces. In 2014, a year after Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang took the helm, Beijing formally gave local governments the right to issue debts as a front door measure. On the other hand, it tried to block the back door by setting the boundary between government liabilities and enterprise liabilities. But it's difficult to close the back door now because the front door initiative of issuing local government debt could hardly meet the local funding needs. Consequently, local governments have continued their borrowing practice by providing implicit endorsement through injecting public welfare assets, issuance of commitment letters, or the use of public-private partnerships or PPPs. The implicit nature of local government debts is a product of China's unique fiscal system and development model. It's the result of Beijing's excessive demand for GDP growth and the public illusion of government underwriting, with no market-oriented risk controls and no trust between central and local governments. No one knows exactly how big the hidden local government debt is. Goldman Sachs estimated last year that it was at 53 trillion yuan, or 52% of China's GDP. I don't think Beijing knows the amount either, because the local government books aren't reliable. It is known that local governments keep separate books for slush funds and other purposes. Liu Jiayi, China's Auditor General, reported in 2014 that, based on an audit of 9 provinces, 9 municipalities, and 18 counties, his agency found 82 billion yuan worth of hidden government funds. I think this number was understated in order to save Beijing's face. With more widespread corruption, no one knows the finances of the local governments accurately. And like a big dysfunctional family, where there is no trust between parents and children, Papa Xi Jinping doesn't know how many assets and liabilities his children have. So, the head of the dysfunctional CCP household decided to further take away the kids' finances. In June 2021, Beijing transferred all non-tax revenues, including income from the transfer of state-owned land use rights, to the central government's taxation department for collection. So local governments have lost an important source of revenue, which amounts to 8 trillion yuan per year. With the recent announcement of a unified national market, Papa Xi is taking his household back to the 1950s, when the central government controlled everything. From his perspective, the children went wild with their finances, and he has no choice but to take them under control. Here's part 1 of the series if you want to find out the historical background of the dysfunctional CCP household and how the debt problem started. That's all for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.